Before we get started, I have a quick favor. I've been self-funding the Finding Genius podcast for 5 years now. I've done over 3,000 episodes. And as you can see on YouTube, we're up over 1 million views on the channel, which is fantastic. The next thing I really want to push on is to get up to 10,000 subscribers. Because once we do, we'll be able to put a donate button and we'll be able to solicit donations to help keep the podcast running and to also get the Finding Genius Foundation moving along. We have a big project studying anxiety, depression, and PTSD and working on a product to help people overcome these problems because I've seen them explode recently after the last 2 years of the whole virus situation. So if you would, please subscribe to the podcast. That would help us tremendously. Give us a thumbs up and check in the description for Buy Me a Coffee. It's about $5. If you could buy me a coffee, I'd really appreciate it. It would help keep the channel going, and I love coffee. Thank you.
Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast. My guest today is Peter Der Manuelian. He's the Barbara Bell Professor of Egyptology. He's a director, part of the Harvard Museum of Ancient Near East. He's a director of what's also called the Giza Project. So we're going to talk about ancient Egyptian history, archaeology, epigraphy, which I believe is ancient writing, and Giza itself. So welcome, Peter. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Richard. Pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, I guess quick check. So epigraphy is what, ancient writing or just the study of writing?
Well, it means different things to different fields. But in Egyptology, we talk about epigraphy, meaning the copying of ancient Egyptian scenes and inscriptions, so making facsimile copies for publication so that we can read the hieroglyphs and have a clearer view of what we're looking at.
I've never been in the presence of hieroglyphs. Are they flush to the wall? Are they, how would they put onto the wall? Were they painted on? Are they...
The answer is all of the above, actually. The Egyptians could carve them so that they protrude out from the wall, which means you sort of carve back everything around them. We call that raised relief. Or they can be incised into the wall, so they're sunk relief. Or they could just be painted onto wooden statues or coffins or temple walls or tomb walls. So you get all the options.
That's cool. I mean, so have rubbings been made? You know, you overlay a paper and rub them if they stick out of the wall?
In the old days, that's what they did to make copies, but that's actually not so great for the ancient walls. So Nowadays, we try not to touch them and we use digital techniques.
Can you use LiDAR to see like the depth of the carvings and any surface features?
Well, they don't usually protrude out that far or that deeply. So LiDAR is usually used for 3D modeling of more three-dimensional objects. But what we use high-resolution photographs and then bring the images up on our screens and use drawing programs that have multiple layers so we can then trace over the images and make the photograph disappear. And then you have a beautiful, clear line drawing of what you have.
Yeah, because I saw recently a whole YouTube video about the Shroud of Turin. And I would guess maybe they've done so many advanced techniques to it to get a 3D image, and maybe that would apply to the work that you do. I don't know if you borrow any of that stuff.
Well, a lot of the fun of working in these ancient fields is that there's always new technology coming along, and so we're always keen to try to apply it to some of these ancient monuments with better results. There's an app called D-Stretch, by the way, which you can actually run a sort of color filter on an object. And so things that are very, very difficult to see suddenly become clear because they're indicated with different colors. So it's a great way to bring things that are previously invisible up to the naked eye.
That's really cool. Okay. Well, tell me, I know I just jumped in. Tell me a bit about like what has been your research about over the years? You know, what have you worked on and what are you working on currently?
Sure. Well, I grew up locally in the Boston area, and we have a great collection here at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. So as a kid, I was very lucky to have a volunteer position in the Egyptian department there and always wanted to be an Egyptologist since about fourth grade history class. So my interest was the language, the hieroglyphs, the monumentality of Egyptian architecture, tomb development, and trying to understand Egyptian history and put some archaeological context onto some of these things. So I went to graduate school got a PhD at the University of Chicago after doing my BA work at Harvard and studied for a year in Germany as well. Then I worked in Egypt for 3 years for the University of Chicago at the site of Luxor and came back and ended up as a curator on the curatorial staff of the Museum of Fine Arts Boston for many, until a position opened up at Harvard. And I've been at Harvard since 2010.
Yeah, I've heard recently, I mean, I don't know if it's BS speculation, but that the pyramids were not tombs and they were instead used for other purposes. Is there any veracity to that?
Not that I know of. So I get almost an email a week with some new theory about pyramid construction and some supposed breakthrough and things. But I think the theory still holds that the 3 pyramids at Giza are royal tombs for kings of the 4th dynasty. So think about 2500 BCE or so. That's the so-called Pyramid Age. And those 3 pyramids are not the only ones in Egypt. There's something like over 70 pyramids in the Nile Valley. And then to the south in Sudan, ancient Nubia, there's about another 150. So these pyramids are absolutely royal tombs for the most part. And they're often surrounded by cemeteries of high officials that take a different form. These are more rectangular structures. They're not pyramid shaped. And so Giza is more than just 3 pyramids. It's actually hundreds and hundreds of tombs, many of them decorated with beautiful wall carvings and scenes and filled with statues and objects of daily life and stele and famous inscriptions.
Are they as large as you have families of them where the pharaohs had the biggest, baddest ones and then everyone else had smaller ones?
Oh, pretty much, yeah. So the 3 kings, Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure, have the 3 large pyramids at Giza. Then there are smaller pyramids for queens, and then these so-called mastaba tombs. These rectangular structures are for the high officials and other royal family members. So they're much, much smaller. They have a part that sticks up above the ground, the superstructure, and then they have burial shafts that go right down underground and end up in a burial chamber. And that's where you find the sarcophagus and the mummy and other burial equipment.
Huh. Are they clustered around the main tomb, like Khufu and all them, his wife, his queen, and all his assistants? Were they structures that were contained within the main pyramid, or were they outside of the main pyramid but clustered around it?
They're outside the pyramid complex itself, but they are around it. And I think there definitely was some benefit to having your burial as close by the royal pyramid complex as possible. So one of the big questions about Giza is how come we still have tombs of these high officials when the kings move on and they start building their pyramids at other sites? We still get tombs being built at Giza. So it's one of the things that we're still exploring and trying to understand who was buried there and in what order. And what were their jobs? What were their family members? What kind of Egyptian art styles did they prefer? How did Egyptian art change over the dynasties? Lots of work still to be done.
Well, what happens if you have a pharaoh and his queen and, some kids and there's not, the order of death is not pharaoh, then queen, then kids. What if it's queen first or kid first, or, how did that manifest and what was built and where?
Well, it usually goes to a son, and normally the oldest son, but that's not always the case. In fact, there was a tomb found by our expedition, the Harvard University Boston Museum of Fine Arts expedition, back in 1927, and it has an image of King Khufu's eldest son on the tomb wall, but he never became pharaoh, so we don't know what was going on. The excavator at the time had all kinds of intriguing theories about murder and usurpation and all of these things, but back then we don't quite have the long historical inscriptions that really lay it all out and tell you what's going on. So we have to put the genealogies together as best we can from fragmentary evidence.
So the pyramids that we could see, is that just because they're so large that they wouldn't have been buried over time? Or is it like you said, a lot of the pyramids were just mostly below grade, so even within a short period of time, they would have been buried?
No, most pyramids are too tall and they're always been visible, especially the ones at Giza. The Great Pyramid of Khufu is 450 feet high, so it was never completely buried. But the surrounding cemeteries of these mastaba tombs, they were buried. And so in about 1903, that's the first time that the Antiquities Authority said, look, it's time to excavate this site responsibly. And there was an American expedition that was led by George Reisner, my predecessor at Harvard and the MFA. And there was a German expedition and an Italian expedition. And they could all see the tops of these mastaba tombs, maybe 10 feet high, 15, 20 feet high, peeking out above the sand and the debris. And they knew there was a lot to excavate. And so they split up the site amongst themselves and started excavating for many, many decades.
And the pyramids themselves, and again, I don't know if there's urban legend or not, can they, if you were to try to remake them today, do we know how they were made? Could we remake them to be just as sturdy as, made when they were first made? Or are there still mysteries about their construction?
It's a good question. Lots of different theories. I think ramps certainly played a role. Could we recreate them today? It would probably be pretty difficult. But you have quite a range in building techniques in the interior chambers, in style, and even survivability of some of the monuments. We have evidence of accidents of royal pyramids at other places, like at Dashur. There's one that's called the Bent Pyramid because about halfway up they changed their minds and changed the angle and realized things weren't working and they needed to just finish it up pretty quickly. So you have different building techniques and with varying degrees of success. There have been many documentaries and experiments to try to emulate the building techniques, but no one has ever attempted to do something quite as tall as the Great Pyramid.
Well, I had a friend that went years ago, and, again, I don't know if it's true, but he said that the blocks were so closely and so carefully laid without mortar, apparently, that you couldn't even fit a credit card between the seams. Is that true?
Some seams are like that. The pyramids have, at Giza anyway, they have interior blocks of limestone and then they're cased. They have an outer covering with much finer white limestone that comes from a different quarry closer to the Nile, on the other side of the Nile, in fact. And sometimes the joins of these surviving casing blocks are really tight and really impressive. But there is mortar. There is all kinds of irregularly shaped blocks in the interior core of the pyramid. And so when you get close up at ground truth, you'll find there's a lot more irregularity than this sort of mystical everything is perfect theory that's out there in the public.
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now back to the show.
Well, what impresses you about their construction that you study them for so long?
Well, the orientation, certainly of the Great Pyramid is impressive. And just to organize a project that large and that ongoing just speaks to the centralized management of the state at the time, because it's not just a local building project. So much of the country was involved in this. And in fact, over a decade ago on the Red Sea coast were found the oldest papyri we have so far that talk about procuring some of the materials and transporting them from one site to another. We even have the journal of a man named Mirer, and he talks about distances and transporting materials and getting across the Nile and how big his crews are and all of these things. So it's almost like a bit of a construction manual that we never thought we would have before. And that's fascinating to me. It's the social organization around the pyramids. I spend most of my time working with the tombs around the pyramids themselves, so I'm not so much focused on construction techniques of the Great Pyramid, but rather studying the social organization of all of these high officials and their tomb decoration and all of these beautiful chapels that are all around the large pyramids themselves.
Well, were the biggest ones built the most carefully or the best, or was it opposite? Were the biggest ones that were kind of more sloppy because of the scale of them?
Great Pyramid of Khufu at Giza is certainly the most carefully built one and has the best orientation, and it's the tallest one. The one of his son Khafre next door looks taller, but it's actually just because it's on higher ground and more of its exterior casing blocks have survived. A lot of the exterior casing blocks have been removed from these pyramids. Mostly people think to build medieval Cairo, so what you would have seen in ancient times would be beautiful, glistening white limestone blocks and a smooth exterior. And what you see today is a more of a stepped affair because these exterior smooth casing blocks have been removed.
Oh, really? So was it not a pyramid shape? Was it a block?
It was pyramid shaped, but it was a lot smoother with these beautiful exterior blocks. So if you look at a photo of Giza, and look at the middle pyramid. Up at the top, it looks like it's wearing a kind of a white hat. And those are the remains of the exterior white limestone casing blocks. Those were never probably because they were just too high up and it would have been too much effort. So look at that sort of hat on the Khafre pyramid and extrapolate. Imagine the whole pyramid going all the way down, being smooth like that and glistening white in the sun. And the Great Pyramid next door would have been the same.
So we're seeing kind of like the interior skeleton. I mean, I know there's more interior to that, but we're seeing the outer layer stripped away. So it's kind of like, an unfinished wall, I guess you could say, is what we're seeing, right?
Exactly.
Oh, that's really interesting.
And there are places where explorers have tried to bust their way in, trying to find entrances, and some even use dynamite in some cases. And so it's kind of an abhorrent method, but what they produced is a kind of a section or a cutaway view that lets you see several courses into the pyramid and give you a kind of a cross-section view of it.
Oh, wow. What did the sunlight do if you had all the exterior blocks and like you said, they were glistening? I'm sure some of the pyramids are made in such a way where maybe the sunlight would glint off them and maybe, I don't know, cause problems. It would blind people that looked at it, or maybe it would reflect onto an area and cause a fire, or I don't know. Is that possible?
I don't think anything that drastic, but when these stones are originally quarried from a site called Tura, these fine white limestone casing stones, they are just beautifully white. And so they certainly would have gleamed in the sun. So you can think of the pyramids as the world's first giant billboard, and they would have been seen from miles around and would have been, blinding and impressive, but I don't think causing any the actual disaster.
And you said also determining the age. How hard is it to determine what was built first and next and next and next? Like what kind of context would you use to determine that?
It's a good question. So Egyptologists, archaeologists use a whole bunch of evidence to try to do that. And we work best when we all work together and use all kinds of different approaches. So one of them is the archaeological context. And it's possible to see that one building is abutting another one. And so therefore one building had to be there first before the next one could attach onto it. So you can build your A's before B kind of theories that way. Also, there's the essence of stratigraphy, which is layers. So in general, archaeological stratigraphy works. As you go down, you reach the earlier layers lower down, unless the context has been disturbed. Then there's art history. You can look at the decoration of the wall chapels and start to see that in Dynasty X, they do things like this, and in Dynasty Y, they change and they start looking like that. So you can start to build a kind of a chronological framework. And now we've got all kinds of archaeological sciences that we can approach the objects with too, thermoluminescence and C14, and with organic materials, we can be analyzing those as well. People are studying the quarries. So if you have a special kind of a stone that a statue was carved from, you might actually know what part of the country the original stone came from. So lots of different ways to go at it.
Oh, okay. What are some of the big mysteries that you're working on today? What is very little known about, but you feel like very important to understand?
Well, lately I've actually been working on the history of Egyptology more than some of the ancient pharaohs. So I've been researching my predecessor, George Reisner, for many, many years. He's a man who was a curator at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and he was a Harvard professor. And he was one of the first modern responsible archaeologists. So he was working in Egypt from about 1903 all the way to his death in 1942, almost nonstop. He died in the middle of World War II. And so I've been studying the history of the field, the development of archaeological method, what people got right back in those days. We're talking about the first half of the 20th century, what they got right, what they got wrong, what times Egyptology had more of a colonial bent to it that we need to correct and set aside nowadays. So in some ways, the modern history of how all this archaeology and Egyptology developed is every bit as fascinating as the Fourth Dynasty history of King Khufu and his state administration and his royal family, or urbanism or town development or hieroglyphic writing and grammar or Egyptian art, any of these other things that are equally interesting.
Yeah, I've heard, I guess, from other archaeologists that the tailings, of early excavations can contain a lot of material themselves. Is there any evidence of that? Piles of rubble from like cruder excavations from many years ago that can be looked through?
You mean, is there a value of revisiting older excavations? Absolutely, there is. Archaeological.
The discard piles and all that, I guess you call it.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, there's a temple associated with the third and smallest pyramid at Giza that Reisner excavated. It's called the Menkaure Valley Temple, and that produced some of the greatest royal statuary we've ever found. Some of it is in the Cairo Museum. Some has just been moved to the brand new Grand Egyptian Museum, which is near Giza and about to open completely soon. And then some of it is in the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, because in those days when you had an excavation permit or contract, you were allowed to have 50% of the finds. That's what they called partage in the old days. The antiquities authorities would say, okay, you found 10 things, you can have 5 and we'll put 5 in the Cairo Museum. Anyway, that temple is being re-explored now by a colleague of mine. And with much more modern archaeological techniques, we're learning an awful lot more about that temple, and we're able to correct some of the interpretations of George Reisner back in 1910.
If you were to, all the material that's been excavated, I know some you'll never know about, but what would be your guess? Like, what percentage of it is in, the Cairo Museum? What percentage is in the British Museum? And what percentage is kind of unaccounted for? Maybe, has anyone done a survey of everything unearthed and gone to see it and cataloged it and looked at the photographs of it, kind of put it onto a cohesive whole to see if that would tell you?
Wouldn't that be nice? There are people who study categories of objects. So there are endless amounts of PhD dissertations and historical treatises, and people who are interested in stelae from the New Kingdom or statues from the Old Kingdom or objects of daily life from the Middle Kingdom. And so, yes, there are these ongoing studies all the time, and people scouring collections all over the world trying to gather these things and put them in some kind of order. No one has gathered it all together. And of course, we don't know what's still under the ground. My colleague Zahi Hawass likes to say that we've excavated something like only 5% of everything in Egypt, and no way to know how accurate a statement like that is. But it is true that every year there are many, many missions working all up and down the Nile Valley and out in the deserts, and new discoveries are being made all the time.
What is your overall picture of Egyptian society? Is it, I don't know, is it really that different from, society today? Like, what are some commonalities that you see, or maybe not commonalities? What are some real differences that you see in how people lived, throughout the various kingdoms versus how they live today? Like, what jumps out at you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I teach what's called a Gen Ed course, a general education course at Harvard on ancient Egypt. And in fact, the Gen Ed system is meant to help students become global citizens and think about different ways of looking at the world and all of that. So rather than just a survey course of Egyptian history, we try to ask exactly some of those questions. Were the ancient Egyptians just like us, or were they completely different from us? It's such a remote period. We're talking about 3, 4, 5,000 years ago. The human condition in many ways has not changed. We're all trying to make sense of the natural forces around us and explain our world. Some of us explain it with mythical deities. Others explain it with human-headed gods. Others have visible fetishes, and others have invisible ones. So there are lots of different ways to try to make sense of these forces all around. And basically, everyone is looking for security, trying to figure out what happens to you after you die, with all the different theories that come along there. The Egyptians worked out a system that made sense for them for many thousands of years. So you could argue that they were doing something right if this held together for such a long period. In other ways, they look very, very different. They have customs and deities and rituals and temples and things that seem remote and are often difficult to understand. Even though we can read the texts, it's not always clear what the rituals are talking about. And when they start merging this god with that god, and you're trying to tell them apart and figure out who's responsible for what, it can get pretty involved at times.
And what were the languages in use throughout the various kingdoms? What were they called?
Well, it's the ancient Egyptian language, and it's written in hieroglyphs. And there's also a cursive way to write hieroglyphs, which is with sort of squiggles and ligatures. So it takes a little extra practice to try to know that you're looking at what to an untrained eye might look like Arabic calligraphy, but it's actually called hieratic. And then just like English morphs and transforms over time, we don't speak the way Shakespeare wrote anymore. Ancient Egyptian goes through many language phases too. So we have an Old Egyptian, a Middle Egyptian, a Late Egyptian, and then we have a few other phases. One is called Demotic, and then finally you get to the last stage of the ancient Egyptian language, which is Coptic. That's the language of Egyptian Christians. And in fact, that language is still alive. That's used in the Coptic Church. It's written mostly with Greek letters. Finally, the Egyptians said, we've had enough with these hieroglyphs. We're going to switch over to this better alphabet. And so Coptic is written not with hieroglyphs anymore, but with mostly Greek letters and a couple of holdovers from Demotic. So that's what scholars and philologists and linguists use, often to try to work backwards. So it's like Latin in the Roman Catholic Church. It never completely disappeared. Coptic is not a dead language. So by working backwards, very often you can try to make connections between Coptic, the last stage of the ancient Egyptian language, all the way back to hieroglyphs thousands of years earlier.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Do native Coptic speakers today, do they make good philologists? I mean, are they more useful to helping you understand hieroglyphics because they're, somewhat closer to it?
Well, they can, but those who are expert at Coptic in Egypt are very often in the Coptic Church. And so their real focus is their religion more than philology and making connections to ancient Egypt. But there are Coptic scholars all over the world, of course, in divinity schools and elsewhere. And it's an important aspect of the religion, of the language.
But when did Arabic come in?
Later with the Arab conquest. So while you'll see some place names in Egypt today in Arabic that have roots and go all the way back to ancient Egyptian names, Arabic is a whole separate language of itself from Egyptian hieroglyphs. People still argue today about the roots of these languages, and they're often called things like Hamito-Semitic languages, as if they have pieces of African languages and pieces of Semitic languages in them. And the debate continues, but it's a fascinating study.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Let's get into some theories. You said every week you get people telling you, I think the pyramids are this, that, and the other. Beyond being tombs, what else do they represent to the societies in which they were built?
Well, I think we tend to think of cemeteries today as empty, quiet places for contemplation. For the ancient Egyptians, I think these cemeteries, or necropoli is another word for them, were sort of living, breathing institutions. So as soon as you could afford it or had the resources, if you were in the upper echelons of society, you would start to build your tomb. And at different periods, the tombs take different shapes, whether they're built-up structures like at Giza, or whether they're rock-cut tombs excavated into a cliff. This, of course, again, is for the upper echelons of society. There were much simpler graves and pit graves and things for others. But these cemeteries develop and grow, and they must have had administrators helping to make decisions about who gets to have a tomb where and how they're laid out. And that's part of the fascination of studying a place like Giza. So they also had rituals where the living would come and enter into these chapels at different times, and food offerings would be laid down for the spirit of the deceased person, and offering spells would be said. And so, like with many religions today, worshiping and honoring the ancestors was an ongoing process. So these cemeteries, I think, were living, breathing institutions and not the empty, quiet places that we might think of in a traditional Western cemetery definition today.
Yeah, I haven't been there. I'd love to go sometime, but on Google Maps, it looks like there's just neighborhoods of regular houses, and there's a wall, and then there's like the two, the pyramids, however many feet away. I mean, it looks like there's some houses in Egypt that you look out your window, you'll just see the pyramid right there, and it's like, I don't know, not even a mile away. Like, how close is modern development now to them? It's so crazy.
Yeah, very true. The modern suburb of Cairo is called Giza. So you might think of Giza is to Cairo as Cambridge is to Boston, if you're familiar with Massachusetts. On a much bigger scale, though, of course, Giza is quite a large city. And yes, the development is sprawling, even out into the desert beyond the pyramids. When I first started working at Giza in 1977, there was much, much less development surrounding the site of the pyramids. But there is a delineated wall going around the site, and there is designated antiquities land. And so they do the best they can to make sure there isn't encroachment on the ancient site itself.
What is the land called, beyond the wall? Like, are people allowed to go there by permit only, or is it government land? Like, what is it?
Well, to the east of Giza is the city of Giza itself, a suburb of modern Cairo. To the west of the pyramids, it becomes desert, and eventually you'll get to Libya if you keep on going. But again, housing developments are sprawling in these directions, to the north of the pyramids, to the west of the pyramids, and eventually to the south as well. I wouldn't be surprised if the antiquity site there is completely surrounded at some point down the road. And many Egyptian sites have these challenges too. The needs of the living outweigh the needs of the dead in many cases. And so there are antiquities officials who do their best to protect the monuments, to protect antiquities land. There are inspectors and inspectorates at all of these hundreds of sites all up and down the Nile. And they do their best they can to protect this cultural heritage.
Yeah, that's amazing. Have there been reports of people like, a problem happens in their basement and they unearth like a passage to, some tomb that was not known about?
These things have happened all the time, or uncovering a statue in your field, or, there are good actors and bad actors in every country. And the right thing often happens and the wrong thing can happen as well. So we try to do the best we can.
Okay. I mean, you spent how much time over in Egypt, like going through the pyramids and seeing them, like being there in person? What would you estimate?
Many times. I used to live there for half of every year in the 1980s when I worked at Luxor, which is several hundred miles to the south, and that's sort of the largest open-air museum for the New Kingdom temples in the Valley of the Kings, where Tutankhamun is buried. And I worked for a project from the University of Chicago there. So that was my longest continuous time. And then I've made many, many trips back and forth since then for shorter periods working at Giza and a few other places as well.
I mean, I know it's hard to encapsulate, but what sense do you get from being inside the pyramids and climbing around them and looking at them? And, you can study all day long, study things, but when you're there, I don't know, did it give you any information that you otherwise would never have had? Like what was being there? What has it done for your knowledge of the place?
Well, it's pretty impressive to be inside the Great Pyramid because you think of where you're standing, the grand gallery, which almost looks like a cathedral in its height, and these passages and burial chambers. Unfortunately, no inscriptions and no grave goods and no bodies. Those were all empty chambers. But it's a pretty amazing experience because you're thinking about this is negative space. This is space that the Egyptians had to leave empty of blocks as they were raising the pyramid course by course. And that takes some pretty cool planning to figure this out. Lately, scholars have been aiming cosmic particle rays at the pyramids, and the way that the muons or particle rays bounce off structures and solids versus empty spaces can help you map things out a little bit. And a couple of large voids or empty spaces have turned up inside the Great Pyramid that no one knew were there before. And so the debate continues today. What are these things? Are they of significance? Do they have any shape or form? Or are they just construction anomalies and just sort of gaps or holes in the construction? And that's an ongoing process. So there will be more exploration of this type, and hopefully we can get behind what these things are, if they are of significance at all.
Are they highly engineered? Are there, in the movies they show like you push this stone and a wall opens, or there's a trap or that kind of stuff. Does any of that really exist, or is it more mundane than that? Like, what are some of the really interesting things that were put into the pyramids, devices maybe to keep people out?
It's not quite like the Hollywood movies, but actually in later periods, such as the Middle Kingdom, there are some pretty ingenious attempts to have portcullis blocks or sort of locking stones that would slide down a corridor and sort of block off a passage and entrance to the pyramid. Later in the Valley of the Kings, you have these sort of pits and things that would make it difficult to keep on going down into the rock-cut tomb. So for thousands of years, there's an ongoing struggle to defeat tomb robbers, and basically they lost that battle. So many tombs were plundered in antiquity or beyond, and very few were found completely intact. Tutankhamun's tomb is an exception, and even that one had been entered a couple of times before it was excavated in 1922 by Howard Carter.
What about the tombs of the lesser members of the household? Like you said, the queen, the higher servants, etc. You said a lot of it was like below ground. There was a burial shaft. Were any of the tombs constructed where they would construct it and then the body would be lowered into it and you weren't expected to ever go into it? Or was there always a way to access them, to put the body in and to go check on it and do whatever he needs to do?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. There are parts of a tomb that are accessible to the living, like the chapel that's usually above ground and has the hieroglyphic names and titles, the job description of the deceased person, and a sort of an offering niche where bread and beer and cuts of meat and milk and things could be laid down as offerings for the spirit of the deceased. And then there are parts of the tombs that were never meant to be visited after the burial, and that would be down the burial shaft, in the burial chamber where the sarcophagus or of stone or the wooden coffin is and the mummy is inside. Those were places that were not meant to be disturbed. And even above ground, there were little rooms called serdabs or statue chambers, and often a statue of the deceased was placed in there. And that was an inaccessible little chamber too. It had no door or entrance, and the spirit of the deceased could sort of magically inhabit that statue and maybe even gaze out through a little window or porthole into the chapel or to the land of the living towards the east.
With modern day archaeology being so much more careful than before, are there places that, you can only go in, I guess, by camera on the end of a long wire, or, I guess places, like you said, there's voids that you can't really drill into to see, like, is there a lot of that inaccessible places that, if you were allowed to just blast your way in, you could, but now you can't?
Fortunately, no one's doing any blasting of that nature these days. But yes, there are difficult excavations and inaccessible places. I'm reminded of one place at Giza, which is on the east side of the Great Pyramid. In 1925, Reisner's expedition, the Harvard-Boston expedition, was working in the Eastern Cemetery, and they came upon an area in the bedrock that looked like it had been disguised. It had been covered over with some plaster to look like bedrock. And they started excavating and removed some blocks and realized it was a burial shaft. And the superstructure, the part above ground, either never existed or it had been dismantled long ago, but it looked like someone was trying to hide something. So they went down and down, and usually these shafts are 5 feet, 10 feet, 15, maybe even 20. This one went down about 90, almost 100 feet down underground. Wow. And it ended up off to one direction in an unfinished little room with lots and lots of furniture that had deteriorated because the wood had desiccated. But there was the gold casings around furniture and stone vessels and gold vessels, and there was a big alabaster sarcophagus and all kinds of other objects there. And that's a perfect case where, with modern technology, you would have had some fun with remote camera systems and things. As it was, they realized they had to go very, very carefully. If they were going to ever reconstruct what this thing was, they would have to lie on mattresses and take photographs of everything, make drawings of everything, pick up with the tweezers every little bit and fragment of a gold hieroglyph here or a fragment of wood furniture there, put it on a tray, give it a number, bring it up, study it. And they eventually realized that they seemed to have the tomb of the mother of King Khufu, the pharaoh who built the Great Pyramid of the 4th Dynasty, right nearby. And it was thanks to such meticulous and slow work that they were able to reconstruct a lot of the queen's furniture. And you can see that today in the Grand Egyptian Museum. And even the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston has a duplicate set. It's not on view at the moment, but there is a second set of it as well. So this is a very famous discovery of the mother of the builder of the Great Pyramid. The big mystery is when they cleaned everything out and were ready to open the lid and gaze on the body of the queen's mummy, the sarcophagus turned out to be completely empty. So that mystery has not quite been solved, whether this really was a tomb or never was a tomb or things got changed. And the last word has yet to be written on this tomb of Queen Hetaperis.
What about the breathing inside the pyramids? I mean, was there any forethought or knowledge of construction? The chapels, obviously you don't want to die of asphyxiation, but are there parts of the pyramids where it's dangerous to go, either because you could fall or hurt yourself or because there's no oxygen there? Or
Well, there are other pyramids that are in various states of, their condition is sometimes questionable. So depending on where you are, this is not just Giza, but maybe it's Saqqara or Dashur or Meidum or other places, you will see that there have been modern buttresses or support pillars or things to protect a roof that is maybe friable or in danger. And so archaeologists try to be as careful as they can. Inside the pyramids, there's not usually any problem of running out of air or asphyxiation. And in fact, in the Great Pyramid, there are air shafts that seem to reach from these chambers all the way out to the pyramid. Whether those were some kind of astronomical orientation or whether they really were about air is unclear, but usually there's enough air to breathe, so no one has ever suffocated inside. That wasn't in a Hollywood movie, that is.
right. Is anyone allowed to go into the pyramids after dark or only in the daytime?
No, and in fact, the 3 pyramids at Giza usually rotate in terms of what's open and what isn't in order to give them a breather. Because there's humidity from human visitors and the site itself opens early in the morning and then closes by 4:30 or towards 5 or so. So generally, unless you have some kind of special permission or there's a rock concert in front of the Sphinx or something like that, no one is supposed to be wandering around the site after hours.
Well, I mean, like you said, the air shafts. Has anyone gone into the pyramid with special permission at night and looked up at the stars and see if you could even see out of the shaft? And maybe just at night, there are things you would notice somehow that you wouldn't otherwise notice.
No, there's no visibility through those shafts. They're small and they may bend a little bit and no one's exactly sure where exactly they come out to. So it's not like you have a telescope view from inside the pyramid to look out onto the stars, unfortunately.
Oh, no one's tried to put cameras up there, up the shaft as far as they can go to see what happens?
Actually, they have, yeah, and they have discovered some painted graffiti and wondering what they mean or whether they're just masons' marks from the guys who were moving the stones and things. So they have done that, and they've actually put little crawling sort of camera devices, and now, of course, with newer technology, you could get ever smaller and ever deeper. But to my knowledge, people are not exploring those shafts further at this time. It's more about the cosmic particle rays and the muons.
Yeah, actually, I just thought about has anyone been allowed to fly a tiny drone through the pyramid? I wonder what you could, if you're allowed, I wonder what you could find.
Well, there's wonderful 360 cameras, and those have been used on walking tours around the site, and there's plenty of drone footage flying over it. Flying a drone inside the chambers of the pyramids, I don't think would really bring you that much more than you could do just holding a 360 camera on a selfie stick above you. Except there is this grand gallery inside the Great Pyramid that's very, very high. And I suppose if you wanted to fly a drone up to the top, you could maybe get some views of the corbelled walls as they get ever tighter and smaller as you get up towards the top.
And how long was it estimated that these pyramids, took to build the biggest ones, Khufu and the other ones? Yeah.
Yeah, still a matter of debate. And in fact, one of my colleagues has been excavating to the south of Giza, and his real interest is the people who built the pyramids. How were they housed? How were they fed? What's the capacity that you could have for these people? But somewhere in the order of thousands of people working, and maybe a couple of decades for the Great Pyramid. The others are smaller and would theoretically take less time. But it's all about the math and the numbers. What can you support? How many blocks can be moved in a day, et cetera? But certainly a decade or two.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I mean, the people that started on the bottom may not have been the people that were up at the top. And as you build it, like you said, block upon block, things get covered over and then they're not accessed for a long time. And, people's different perspective on it, when it was a third of the way built, halfway built, et cetera, would be very different. It'll be interesting. I wonder if anyone's created like a time-lapse recreation of how they would have been built, and maybe there's some insight there as it was built and you were the different layers. What would you have seen that you otherwise wouldn't have seen,
Well, that was the negative space I was referring to before. So if you think if the pyramid is 1/3 or 1/2 built and you were walking across the top of it, as the flat surface of what's been built so far, you would see a sort of cutaway hole where chamber A or chamber B or corridor X would be located. And so as you go up course by course, you had to be planning to leave that area open to create that passageway or that corridor. So that's a way of thinking in 3 dimensions that I find fascinating.
Do people think that those spaces were necessary to continue the construction? Like people would have stood in them and built up around them, and then finally, as the pyramid got high enough, then it was closed off and they abandoned that chamber and there's no access? Or...
Well, there would be access from the entrance that would then go through a corridor and get into some of these chambers. So that was always part of the burial plan. The king's body would have been put inside, and there is actually an undecorated sarcophagus inside the so-called king's chamber in the Great Pyramid, and that had to be brought in, of course. So it's the planning and the architectural thinking in 3 dimensions that had to go on as the pyramid was slowly rising.
Yeah, amazing. Very, very cool. Okay, well, for people interested, what's a good starting point for them? I'm sure it gets very, very specific, very technical, et cetera, as you go along, but what's like a good initial overall understanding of ancient Egypt for people to start on? Maybe one of your books or...
Yeah, plenty of terrific books out there, from the very simple and the short to the very complex. For Giza, there's a big book by my colleagues Mark Lehner and Zahi Hawass called Giza and the Pyramids, The Definitive History. And that's a good thing to read about Giza. For the history of some archaeology in Egypt and how some of these great expeditions got underway in the first half of the 20th century, the book I spent a long time working on is called Walking Among Pharaohs, George Reisner and the Dawn of Modern Egyptology. And that's by Oxford University Press. Came out a little over a year ago or so. And that tries to touch on a lot of these big issues, repatriation, the development of archaeology, Western missions working in Egypt, the British controlling the government, the French controlling the Antiquities Service, the Egyptians yearning for independence, of course. It's a fascinating time, both in terms of the ancient history and the modern approach, modern colonialist history of modern Egypt, too.
Well, very good. Well, Peter, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. It's been a really interesting call, and I appreciate you fielding my kooky questions. So thank you.
Excellent, Richard. Nice to talk with you. Thanks very much.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.